a forum titled Middle East Challenges for the Bush Administration, sponsored by the Middle East Institute.
The conference has been planned for some time, and we had a different idea of the structure of it and the way our topics would be dealt with a couple of weeks ago. And now we have to face changed circumstances, practically speaking. But I would like to emphasize that while the news is completely filled with special forces moving into Afghanistan, bombs falling, wars against terrorism, and so on, there is a whole other world of issues out there. And these issues are very much related to what we're talking about when we talk about a war on terrorism. It is, I think, clear to the President, to the Secretary of State, Defense, it certainly is clear to a lot of you, I know, that you don't win a war on terrorism with bombs and special forces. You win it by very hard work, diplomacy, work, cooperation, coordination between legal authorities, intelligence authorities, and over time. It takes a lot of hard work, a lot of cooperation, and a lot of time. To get that cooperation, we have to create the best environment for cooperation in the region. That means you can't dictate to people. You have to listen to them. You have to have conversations with them, dialogue with them, and come to mutually satisfactory conclusions about how to proceed. You also need to do the things that people are worried about, things that people are concerned about. And that means you've got to worry about things like the peace process, the things like the Palestinian-Israeli issue. You do have to worry about the plight of Palestinians who are no longer able to get jobs and are hungry. You need to be concerned about the Iraqi people who are the victims of Saddam Hussein, but also, because of Saddam Hussein, the victims of sanctions. And all of these are issues that need to be thought about. You know, one of the things that bothered me about the tragedy, the terrible attack on the United States that took place on September 11th, was the immediate reaction that you couldn't talk about causes. If you talked about causes, somehow you were being disloyal. Somehow you were saying that because you're talking about causes, you are justifying the action. Nothing can justify the action. I don't think anybody has begun to try to do so except for Osama bin Laden. The whole world has come out against that action. Islamic scholars, religious leaders have all made it very clear that this is an action against God, against religion. So we should not be ashamed or apologetic about trying to look at why things happen. That should be part of our overall total obligation. Particularly we as an institute, Middle East Institute, we should be concerned about seeking the truth, informing our colleagues, our friends, members of Congress about the truth. So I hope that this will be the guiding, the objective of the discussions that we have today, and tomorrow, not to focus on the events of the moment, but to start focusing on why the events of the moment are taking place. I want to just read a quotation by a very famous scholar who you'll be meeting in a few minutes. And this I take as sort of the guiding principle for the Middle East Institute and the way we should be doing our work. I have always believed that good scholarship can be relevant and consequential for public policy. It is possible to affect public policy without being an advocate, to be passionate about peace without losing analytical rigor, to be moved by what is just while conceding that no one has a monopoly on justice. I think those are very important words, and they should be one of the reasons that we exist as an institute. In 1 second, I will introduce Shibley, whose quotation that was. I have a couple of small announcements. First, I particularly want to express my thanks to the sponsors of this conference. You'll find their names represented on the back page of the program. And if you see representatives and say a word of thanks to them, I'd appreciate it. Also, it would be a courtesy if everybody would reach in their pocket and pull out their cell phone and turn it off. It is a bit distracting for someone who's speaking who is seriously thinking about a question to have the ringing go off. During the question and answer sessions, we will welcome questions from the floor, but they need to be written on a 3x5 card. You'll find those in your registration folder. Somebody will be around to collect the cards, and then we will read off the questions. This is for efficiency purpose, not for purposes of deciding which questions and not which questions. Good. Now, we are extremely fortunate to kick this conference off to have Dr. Shibli Telhami as our keynote speaker. Shibli holds the Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, College Park, and he's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He was previously the Director of Near Eastern Studies at Cornell University. He got his doctorate in political science at the University of California at Berkeley. Shibli is known to most of you, I think, if you read the Washington Post, the New York Times, or the Los Angeles Times, because he's a contributor on a very consistent basis to each of these newspapers. And his name appears on the op-ed pages far more than mine does. How do you do that, Shibli? Any event, it's always worth reading the articles that he puts forward. He's the author of a number of books and has been engaged in the issues of the Middle East for a long time. I know Shibli best because from our first introduction to one another when he was named to the Trilateral American-Israeli-Palestinian Anti-Incitement Committee, which was a product of the Y agreement, the Y River Agreement. I was sort of organizing that, and we had an outstanding panel of Americans who were helping us on that process. I must say, Shibli, we were not as successful as I would have liked to believe, but we had the right idea. And that is still the right idea, because one of the key elements of making peace is to have people stop shouting at each other and start listening to each other. So I hope that we can recreate some kind of an effort along these lines in the future. Well, without further ado, it is my great privilege and honor to introduce Dr. Shibli Telhami as the keynote speaker. Shibli?
Thank you very much. It's really a great honor and privilege for me to speak before you this morning. And forgive me if I say a lot that you do know and you have thought about. So let's at least, given that everyone here knows the Middle East as well as I do, let's perhaps think of it as a thinking aloud session. And thank you for at least giving me the privilege to listen to my thoughts on this issue. What I'd like to do is answer 4 questions out loud, and in the process address some of the consequences of the horror that we all faced on September 11th, some of the consequences for American foreign policy and some of the consequences for the Middle East. The 4 questions are the following. What is this terrorism phenomenon, and what is the role of religion in it? This obviously is a question that has been much debated in recent weeks. The second question is, what is the source of the broader anger at the U.S. in the region? And third, where are the moderates in the Middle East today? And that is a question that is clearly posed out there in the debate. Finally, what can the U.S. do to win the war on terrorism and to help the moderates win against the militants in the region? So let me begin by addressing the first question about this horror that the U.S. witnessed, really that the international community witnessed, and what we make of it in terms of who are these people who are willing to commit such horror, and why it is why is it that it has created so much fear, not only here but elsewhere? Well, at one level, it's very obvious why. This was a horror on a huge scale. A few people able to create so much pain in one day that it essentially shakes the international order with mere knives. It's quite extraordinary. That itself, the very fact that you'd have people who are capable of it and willing to do it, is itself very scary. But I think there was something else that was scary that perhaps is the reason why we tend to look for mysterious answers. And that is that these people seem to come from often well-educated families, themselves well-educated. And not only that, but they seem to be willing to die, willing to commit suicide in the process, and therefore seem to be insensitive to punishment and reward, therefore irrational by our understanding of rationality, and perhaps even motivated by blind faith that you can't affect. So if you have people you cannot punish and you cannot reward, who could be among you next door looking like you and can attack you at any time and create such horror, it is doubly scary. Evil is scary enough, but evil and mysterious and irrational is doubly scary. And what I'd like to do is to argue first and foremost that these perpetrators are evil, but they are not irrational or mysterious, and that this is not about faith. I know that we have said that this has become a cliche, and fortunately our government has said it and the president has said it, and it's been so stated. It's not a clash of civilization, but we fall back into this looking for religious answers inadvertently, almost because we just can't help it, because we can't figure out why, how could this happen? How could people like this commit suicide in the process of committing horror on this magnitude? And let me begin by saying, first, let's separate for a moment analytically the fact, the willingness to commit such horror, the willingness to commit such acts, and the willingness to die. Let's separate them analytically for a moment. In terms of willing to commit violence on large scale for political ends, if you look at actually the history of violence, political violence in the world, not just in the Middle East, it has often been carried by the educated segments of society. I mean, when you look at the revolutionary movements, so-called, whether it's Marxist or the Che Guevaras of the world or the Arab nationalists, or some of the Palestinian secular organizations in the 50s and 60s, they often attracted the educated segments of society. That's, in a way, not a puzzle. It's not a puzzle because typically the educated segments of society are less accepting of the inferiority in society. Generally, the more educated people are, the less accepting they are of injustice. And more important, they understand that they can do something about it. The public may not understand power very well and may be resigned to its fate, but the more educated you are, the more willing you are, the more understanding you are that you can change things. Now, most educated people, unfortunately, are good in the sense that they use it in a good way. That's why a lot of the intellectual revolutions, a lot of the good, positive political movements are also led by the educated. But the educated have evil among them, just like the uneducated have evil among them. And those educated evil are more willing to act than the uneducated evil. That's just a fact of life. It's the history of political violence in the world. So it's not a puzzle. It's got nothing to do with Islam. It's not a puzzle historically that this would be, the educated would be leaders even in this ugly act. I mentioned in the process Arab secular movements in the 50s and 60s and Palestinian groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which has just assassinated a minister in the Israeli government. Those groups, by and large, we should remind ourselves, who were willing to use violence for political ends, were certainly in the 50s and 60s not driven by Islam at all. They were mostly secular nationalists. And in fact, the PFLP happened to be founded by a Christian physician. And it was not alone in its makeup. And it, by the way, attracted a disproportionate percentage of the educated among the Palestinians. for its cause. In the 50s and 60s, the source of violence was seen to be secular nationalism in the region, not Islamic fundamentalism. In fact, it was the opposite. There was even a theoretical interpretation in the West that Islam is a passive religion. In fact, unlike what we have now about the violent nature of Islam, Islam was seen to be the perfect example of, quote, the opiate of the masses, of justifying the status quo, the instrument of the status quo. It was seen to be, people would refer to the common Arabic phrase, alhamdulillah, thank God, for essentially as a phrase that accepts one's fate. Fate was the term that we heard in the literature about Islam during that period. And clearly that even defined political alliances across the board. That should be a reminder to us all that it's not religion that is at play here. It's not theology. It is something else that is at play here. Today, it is a fact of life that most political militancy, not all, as we were reminded by the PFLP, most political militancy in the region is carried out by Islamic groups, or groups that are doing it in the name of Islam. At the very same time, by the way, that we must remind ourselves that the vast majority of Islamic fundamentalist religious groups are not violent. But nonetheless, most violent groups today in the Middle East do it in the name of Islam. That is alone an interesting question that we have to recognize. It wasn't the case in the 50s and 60s, but as a sociological political phenomenon, what explains that? That is a reality that we have to accept. Well, it's not that hard to understand. What we have in the Middle East is a political system that does not allow legitimate political organization for opposition. And there is much despair in the region. There is much need for organizing political opposition. This despair is connected to the political order, the economic order, and foreign policy issues such as the Palestinian question, the Iraq question. And people cannot affect their lives. In fact, by the way, that is why bin Laden plays to those groups, because what bin Laden tries to do is empower people. There is a sense of empowerment for people who say you can't make a difference, people who are resigned to their fate. He says to them, look, with a few dozen men and knives, we're able to shake up the world. You can do it. So there's an empowerment message. Certainly that empowerment message scares most people, because most people in the region don't want to live in a bin Laden's world. But it empowers enough people to carry this out. And we have to keep that in mind. When you consider the issue of suicide, one can come up with a even greater link between Islam and this thesis. After all, how could you explain rationally that an individual may be willing to die for the cause? And certainly the justification that is employed is the doctrine of martyrdom, that people are dying for the promise of the afterlife. And this conception, this notion of martyrdom, seems to be the justification that people use. How could you explain the fact that people are willing to die for a cause, to commit suicide for a cause? And here too, I think that there is a lot of misconception. And let me just say three things about that. First, when you look back, if the assumption is that this is a prevalent theological understanding in Islam, that people are mostly looking for the afterlife, not for this life, all you have to do is look at our television screens today to see the hundreds of thousands of poor, faithful Afghani civilians who are running away from death to live, even if they have to live as refugees. And that should be a reminder of the humanity that is transcends anyone. Or, for that matter, to look at bin Laden's old recruitment tapes. Bin Laden uses in his recruitment tapes pictures of death of Muslims and elsewhere in order to move his public to act. It is death that is used to move people to act. Certainly that is not a theological interpretation. It's true that it is used by by terrorists for that purpose. But if you look back actually at the Palestinian groups, the secular Palestinian groups, they were called fidaiyin. Fidaiyin are those who sacrificed their lives for the cause. That was the term used. And of course they were called martyrs, even though they were secularist. Whether they were Christian or Muslim, they were called martyrs when they died. I mean, that was not something that was unusual. But I also will remind you that in the Middle Eastern context specifically, this phenomenon of martyrdom, this phenomenon of suicide bombings emerged in Lebanon in the 80s. And the attackers who used this method were almost entirely Hezbollah. And as a consequence, I will remind you of the common interpretation among some of the Islamic scholars here in this country in the West of that phenomenon. They specifically said this is Shiite theology, and I ask you to look back at that literature. It was Shiite theology, it wasn't Sunni theology. In fact, there was so much separation in the discourse because the Shiites are the ones who really believe in martyrdom, but not the Sunnis. And there was a great deal of discourse all about that. Well, as it happened, by the end of the 90s, the Shiites stopped doing it. And the Sunnis started doing it. Because the Hamas is almost all Sunni. It is all Sunni, at least in the Palestinian arena. And so now we're, again, linking it to a broader theological interpretation about Islam. Well, again, remind ourselves, well, sure, suicide is difficult to explain, but how many people are willing to do it? Very few. And those few have to be explained strictly by thinking about these groups as cults. And there has to be a psychological interpretation of akin to brainwashing of how these people are persuaded to do it. But as from the point of view of a group, suicide is terrifyingly rational, terrifyingly efficient. Because if you are a group that is evil and willing to commit such death anyway, suicide methods are very effective because they're very difficult to defend against, for one thing. But even from the point of view of the losses of the group itself, you lose a lot less people by targeting their death than by sending large numbers in guerrilla warfare against superior armies. You would inflict fewer casualties on the enemy and you would lose more people. So it is incredibly efficient once you get over this individual hurdle in the thinking of a terrorist group. So it is, therefore, we have to look at this issue a lot more rationally than we have had. It is a terrifying method. We should delegitimize it, and certainly Muslims should delegitimize it because it's not a Muslim issue. It is just a horrible method of killing people that has to be identified. Let me move to the second question, which is the sources of the broader anger at the U.S. in the region. There is no question that bin Laden and al-Qaeda had their own motives, and those motives are really ambitious, pertaining to a broader Islamic state, an intolerant one akin to the Taliban state, and they see no room for outsiders, or for Israel for that matter, in their world. That is their vision. But that is not what they argue when they try to sell themselves on tapes. That is not what they argue when they go on television to reach the broader audience. Why? Because they know that vision is at odds with the great majority of the people in the region. They can't sell it. So what do? They choose issues over which the public is very angry and that resonates with the public. And there is a lot of anger. That is neither the cause nor the justification of the action of the terrorists, but there is a lot of anger to be exploited. And terrorists do exploit anger and despair. They exploit it in very deliberate ways. They exploit it for recruiting members. They exploit it for fundraising. They exploit it for winning a public relations campaign against sitting governments that they want to defeat. And so they clearly use it instrumentally. But why do they use it instrumentally? Because it works. because there is real anger out there. There is real despair out there. And that despair is what I call the demand side of terrorism. That is the despair that is out there to be exploited by horrible groups who have different aims. And you can destroy the supply side of it if you keep the demand side of it sitting. Other terrorist groups with other ugly aims are going to try to exploit it. And we have to understand that. And what is this source of the anger in the region then that I'm talking about? Well, it is certainly not one issue. And it's certainly not only the Arab-Israeli issue. There is pervasive anger in the region, pervasive despair, pervasive helplessness. And it is connected to a perception of an economic and political order that is disadvantageous, over which people have no control, and of which the U.S. is seen to be the anchor, and therefore the subject of a lot of the anger. That is clear. So there is economic despair, there's political despair, there is foreign policy despair. That is clear. And the U.S. is the anchor of that system. But I would suggest to you, true as this is, it does not explain the level of anger. Because if you look, you can make similar arguments that there would be anger based on inequality of sense of political hegemony in other parts of the third world, in Latin America, Africa, Asia, but there you don't have the same depth of mobilization and anger as you do in the Middle East. And the question is why? So while that is true, there is a difference, a categorical difference in the magnitude of what we see in the Middle East. And I suggest to you that those specific issues that we focus on are not just issues, but they explain a lot, including the level of the magnitude of the passion. And the issues on foreign policy, including the Arab-Israeli issue, and especially the Arab-Israeli issue, but also the human suffering in Iraq, play into this psychology. Allow me to explain this a little bit, because I think as we discuss this issue, there is a lot of misunderstanding and perhaps debate about whether the Palestinian issue remains important, whether this is just an instrument used by people. Last spring, I conducted a survey in 5 Arab countries that included Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Lebanon. And I asked people how important the Palestinian issue is to them personally. I can tell you that in 4 of these countries, Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, and Kuwait, nearly 60% of the people said that it is, quote, the single most important issue to them personally. And in Egypt, 79% of the people said it's the single most important issue to them personally. That is astonishing. And it might seem to some to be hypocritical, because how could this be? How could this finding be true in places like Kuwait, where we know there's a lot of resentment toward Palestinians, where we know they don't like Yasser Arafat because of his position in the Gulf War, where they know they expelled Palestinian workers after the Gulf War? How could this be true? Or how could this be true in Lebanon? Well, I think we have a misunderstanding of what this issue means in the region. We think of it in very simplistic terms. This issue is central to the collective consciousness in the region, to the collective Arab and Islamic identity. In the past half a century, it has been central to the formation of the collective identity. In the same way, I would submit to you that Israel has become an integral part of contemporary Jewish identity. And so thus, when an Arab or a Muslim makes a judgment about the world, subconsciously, they make a judgment through the prism of the Palestinian issue, even if they don't like Arafat or the Palestinian Authority. It is an instinctive reaction, in the same way that you might have a Jewish person who does not like Ariel Sharon in Israel, or might even blame him for some of the troubles. But if there is a sense of threat to Israel, they're going to support Israel. There is that instinctive reaction in the Arab world that sees much of the world through this prism. And I do think that we have had a misunderstanding both about what is happening now and what has happened over the past decade, and it's worth going over a bit. There are people who believe that this is all the doing of the media. You know, that this is a function of a new media in the region that is sensational, that is just showing too much blood on television over the past year, especially during the Intifada. And by the way, there is. I mean, that is true. But let me tell you this. My research shows that Al Jazeera phenomenon has nothing to do with this. In Saudi Arabia, for example, those who didn't watch Al Jazeera ranked the Palestinian issue higher in their priorities than those who did watch Al Jazeera. And in Egypt, where only about 7% of the people have satellite television altogether, you had the largest share of the public saying, 79%, saying the Palestinian issue is most important to them. It is not Al Jazeera phenomenon. In fact, we have to understand what this Al Jazeera phenomenon is. It is a new market-driven phenomenon. They are catering to the market. There's a lot of competition for media out there. People watch Al Jazeera because of the product it presents, because that's what they want to see. That is where they are. And so it reflects where they are rather than makes them what they are. It doesn't explain their identity. It chooses issues that resonate. That's why it's popular. Well, why are people dropping other media to watch that or some others, or NBC? Because these media are providing to the public what they want. We have a new phenomenon. It's a market-driven phenomenon. The media, given all that competition, is producing, it has to produce what the public wants in order to succeed. In fact, it's not a surprise that when you look back just only 2 years ago, Al Jazeera was the subject of criticism in the Middle East, in the Arab world, for being too pro-Israel, for allowing members of the Knesset to appear on Al Jazeera regularly. What has changed in the past 2 years is not Al Jazeera. It is the world. What has changed in the past 2 years is that you have a complete transformation of the environment. We had a world in the 1990s that had a seemingly working peace process. People could point to it. And when somebody moderate in the Arab world debated an extremist on Al Jazeera or anywhere else, they could not only reject the extremist method, but they could also put forth a positive alternative. They could say, look, we have a peace process, it's around the corner, we're going to have an agreement. It was a paradigm of peace and prosperity that carried us through the 90s. And that paradigm collapsed. It collapsed at the end of the 90s. And the media is a reflection of the public mood. It's not the driver of the public mood, as it is here, in my judgment. And as a consequence, you have the moderates having very little to show in their battle of ideas. And you have Al Jazeera much more reflective of a more militant trends because they're on the offensive and the moderates are on the defensive. And I will come back to this theme a little bit later on. Let me move to this question of moderate voices in the Middle East. I think there is no question in my mind that what we faced is not simply an American or global war on terrorism or on militancy, but we face a battle for the soul of the Middle East, that there is a profound internal battle going on, and that ultimately, in fact, the outcome of the broader global battle will be a function of what happens in that local battle in the region between moderates and militants. And in my judgment, what has transpired in that horror in New York is that the vast majority of the moderates, and certainly the elites in the region, were not only horrified by it, but also terrified by the prospect that militants might rule their own world. And in that sense, there is tremendous fear and there is tremendous apprehension in allowing the militants to take the lead. But don't forget that there is the other side, which is there was a huge message of empowerment to those who are inclined to use militant methods, because that message was, it works. And those people who want change at almost any price will be mobilized. Don't kid yourself, whether they're directly mobilized by bin Laden or they're copycats. That is the fear, that is the horror that we might face. Because it is too easy to commit terror, especially if you're willing to die. And we have to remind ourselves of that the battle isn't just with bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. There has to be a battle, a war of ideas. We, in the West, the United States, cannot wage that war of ideas, frankly. That war of ideas, for one thing, we would not be trusted to wage that war of ideas. It has to be waged from within. And the moderates are on the defensive. They're on the defensive for the reasons that I described earlier. That in the 1990s, after the Gulf War, they had a vision to offer. It was not a perfect vision, by the way, and it had ups and downs, but it was a vision enough to keep enough of them, governments, elites online, to try to put forth an alternate vision to that of the militants. That whole thing collapsed. And that's one reason why they're on the defensive. Because right now, I've watched many of these media in the past year, not just since September 11. And I've appeared on much of it. When people discuss issues, the militants will ask the moderate, what are you going to do about it? They say, well, we can go back to the peace process. What has that brought you after 10 years of promises? What happened to the prosperity that was promised? What happened to the political change that was promised? What happened? And look at the bloodshed that is continuing. And so you're on the defensive, and therefore it's very, very, very hard to put forth an alternate vision that people are going to buy. You can create one, but you can't lie to the public. You have to have something real to be able to get public trust. Second, I do think that there is a broader phenomenon in the reluctance of moderates to wage their own war of ideas. And I don't think it's just simply an absence of courage. I think it's more a phenomenon of this pervasive sense of powerlessness in the region that reaches into the elite segments. And that pervasive sense of powerlessness is a function, in part, of the historical legacy of self-consciousness of the people in the region, that the entire world order in which they exist has been a creation of imperial powers and continues to be a function of imperial interest. There is a dominating paradigm that paralyzes thinking, but is also a function of the reality on the ground, that many people don't have much power to change their own lives in the context of the existing political systems. And as such, there is a sense of helplessness, and certainly a sense of inability to wage collective battles. Individual voices are heard, but certainly not collective voices. And so we have that problem, and I would submit to you that ultimately the moderates in the region, those who want a tolerant political system, whatever it is, who want normal lives for their children, who want to be tied to the rest of the world, who are, in my judgment, a majority, are going to have to find more courage despite all this weakness. There is too much ugliness out there that people are not speaking about. But we can help, and this is where I would want to turn my final remarks on the U.S. role. I do think that the U.S. policy right now cannot be oriented at, quote, winning the hearts and minds of the Middle East in the short term. That is not going to happen. I mean, you have a legacy of decades that's based on policy and impression. You're not going to be able to change the paradigm overnight simply by a charm campaign. People are not going to trust the message if they don't trust the messenger, especially in the middle of a crisis when they see it as instrumental. In fact, it might work against them. Moreover, we have seen, for example, high-level administration officials trying to go on these media that are now popular and say, I'm going to speak to the Arab people directly. Well, the problem is you have a second handicap here, because every single official in the back of their mind is not really speaking to Egyptians, but speaking to Congress, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, because that is the backlash that they have to worry about a lot more than the backlash in the region. And therefore, in the process, they reinforce the very paradigm that the region is fearful of. And you can't do that and succeed. In my judgment, the battle should be waged differently. it shouldn't be seen as a direct battle between the U.S. and even the militants. It should be seen as an internal battle within the region between the militants and the moderate elites. And it should be, our policy should be oriented toward helping the moderates win their own battle, empowering them, helping them, assisting them to win their own battle of ideas. I'm not talking about military causes. I'm talking about the battle of ideas. And that entails a number of things that we can do. And let me end with the two most important issues that I think we can work on in conveying to the region a sense of mission, a positive vision that we're not only against terrorism, but we're also for something that the region wants. The one thing that the terrorists have against them, other than their method, is that they have no real positive alternative. They only can promise change, and people want change. They're willing to take risk, but they don't have an alternative to provide the public. That is an arena that could be a vacuum that could be filled by coming up with what we stand for, what people who don't want a world dominated by militants stand for. And here, I think there are two areas where we can make a difference. One area is the apparent confusion, both here and in the region, about the nature of this campaign against terrorism. We are sending confusing signals. On the one hand, we say this is a battle against Al-Qaeda and its allies. And on the other hand, we say this is a battle on world terrorism. Well, those are two separate missions, and we're lumping them together as if they are one and the same. And the fears in the region are that this whole campaign is only designed to eliminate groups in the Middle East only, to focus on those groups that have to do with Arab and Muslim interests, not the broader international phenomenon. And I think we have to be very clear on our mission. I think we have two separate missions. The first mission is to defend against those who attack the United States and to respond to those who attack the United States. By the way, that is a right of self-defense of the United States of America. You don't need, if you can show responsibility, you don't need any additional international backing or legitimacy. You don't need a coalition except instrumentally. But in principle, it is an automatic American right to do it. And even though many people in the region are critical maybe of the way it's conducted, most people understand that what was committed against the U.S. is such horror that the U.S. certainly has the right to respond. But the second mission is different, because it is not about being attacked. It is about a broader war on terrorism that is much more complicated even in its attainment. You need tremendous international cooperation even to succeed, both in terms of intelligence sharing, financial cooperation, and more. But more importantly, we cannot singularly define it. We cannot choose which groups we should fight and which we should not. And we should therefore send a signal that we will work with international organizations, as we have begun to do with the UN, to define what it is that we're against. And I submit to you that the focus should be on anyone targeting civilians deliberately, that should be a new norm over which we can create a new treaty through international organizations that should be universally applied in the Middle East and elsewhere, but that we should not begin the war by saying this group and this group is next, because that will play very much into the fears in the region and reinforce them. The second thing that I would say that is important here is this vision thing. We have to help the moderates rally behind a global vision that would give hope. There is despair out there. Without hope, you're not going to be able to defeat the militants. And here I think there are two very important areas where we can do something. One is to create an international forum that would begin a dialogue about economic change and would signal the commitment of significant resources to help the region develop economically and with it politically. We're not going to do it overnight, but to begin a process with significant signals of commitment would do a lot to help. The second is the Arab-Israeli issue. As I said, that is a central issue. It is not a sufficient condition for stability in the region. Arab-Israeli is absolutely a necessary condition. And unless we have a robust and credible peace process that people can trust, we're not going to buy hope in the short term. Let me end with the following. I think what the biggest campaign, the biggest war in the next months and early years will not be the military campaign. That will be hard enough. It will be the war of ideas that has to be waged. And it will be much more difficult to wage than the military campaign. And it will require a lot of resources, a lot of patience, and a lot of deliberation. But I must ask you to think again about the sort of danger that we face today, just to remember what happened on September 11th as a symptom of a pervasive problem, of a danger that lurks ahead that is not only to the U.S. but to the international system and to the Middle East itself. We cannot afford to get it wrong. Thank you very much.
All right, Shibli will now take some questions from the audience. If you have a question, if you could raise your hand and just give it to one of the young men going around, then I will read it. Boy, I wish I had handwriting that good. Shibli, the question is, are Muslims going to publicly pronounce and believe in their hearts that suicide, murderers, and terrorists are not martyrs? What will it take to overcome this deception? Do you believe this nihilism will change before violence forces it to? Will Jews and Christians be able to see any similarities to suicide, murders, terrorists, and the Bible telling of the story about the life and death of Samson?
Yes, I do think that the question of legitimacy is extremely important. Can you hear me on this microphone, by the way, or do I need to turn it on? Maybe I'll stand. It's a little better.
Why don't you go over there, and then I can just read the questions in a loud voice.
I think the inherent I think question here about the legitimacy of suicide bombings and the legitimacy of terror in general is very important. I do think legitimacy matters. I think the way a society and a public looks at an issue matters. That's why I think it's a war of ideas ultimately, not just a military war. And that is why I think in the war on terrorism, the most important component will be an international campaign to delegitimize targeting civilians deliberately by anyone and to put automatic international collective resources to respond to it, wherever it happens. And we'd have to be consistent. We can't be selective in that. On the issue of suicide bombing specifically, I do think that people are going to have to do more. They have to be delegitimized because they're a threat to society. They're more of a threat to society than they are a threat to an enemy. And I think that there have been voices, obviously there have been voices who said it's wrong, and there have been theological findings that it's wrong. And in fact, those who find it right have to twist a lot of Islamic theology to make it right. But ultimately, I think that you shouldn't look at this as an Islamic issue again. The reason it exists is because there are terrorist groups that think it's efficient to use, and they will do what they have to use it. And we have to understand that. So it's not, there is a legitimacy component to it, but there's an instrumental component to it. It is employed because it is seen to be an efficient by a group that may use, if it doesn't use the theology to explain it, to recruit or brainwash its members, it'll probably use something else. But I don't think society should celebrate it. I don't think society should celebrate it, and I think there should be a signal that it's not something to be celebrated.
Shibli, there are a number of questions here all related. They relate to the question of the political leadership in the region. and the ability of this leadership to influence the moderates when they tend to be more or less liberal than the average moderate. In other words, the elites are possibly too involved in anti-democratic tendencies.
No, I understand, and let me just tell you, you know, one of the fears I have and how I think about it, at least. I mean, we have obviously in this campaign against terrorism, there is a tendency on the one hand to fear anarchy most, because anarchy is conducive to terrorism. We know that. I mean, we know that where you don't have strong central authority, you have more terrorism. And so therefore, in a sense, states have emerged as the key allies in the war on terrorism, because they don't want terrorism to win. Terrorism is a danger to states in general, not just to particular states. States want to monopolize violence. They don't want to be threatened by non-state organizations. So they are the natural allies. And in the process, we're actually going to strengthen states and governments in this fight against anarchy where we see it. And yet, we could in the process fall into supporting more and more repression, which obviously raises more and more anger. We have a problem. Simply, I don't think it is a black and white choice. There is obviously a need in the region to liberalize politically. Unless the region liberalizes and modernizes, it's going to have huge problems down the road, no matter what happens with the U.S. It is an internal problem. It is a problem for every state in the region. Unless it liberalizes politically, it's going to face a major crisis. Most of them are, but they're going to face more. The question is, how do we, as the United States of America, deal with it? Let me just say that as a student of politics in general, modernization, political liberalization, when I look at examples of democratization, democratization is a very messy business. It takes a long time. Most of it is unpredictable. Sometimes you have anarchy in the interim. And that is even when you have some very good people who are trying to do it within, who really want to do it. And that's without outside interference. I don't have much faith in our ability to micromanage democratic transitions in any country, and certainly not over a region. And therefore, what my approach would be is twofold. One is we can make our position clear publicly, even if we don't necessarily push people directly, that we should stand behind certain American values, particularly on human rights, and that certainly empowers a lot of these elites just by virtue of connecting with our ideas. But secondly, perhaps the more important one, is we have to focus on economic liberalization. That is an issue that resonates, that's an issue that is needed, and if we do that well, with transparency, we can then bring political liberalization along with it. It has to be a focus on economic liberalization, because that's an issue that resonates both with elites, with governments, and with the public, and is badly needed.
Okay. Bernard Lewis last night on Charlie Rose asserted that the U.S. must act forcefully and unilaterally as efforts to consult with Arab and South Asian allies will be seen in the region as a weakness. Why should we put so much emphasis on consultation as opposed to unilateral action?
You know, again, I think there are obviously two competing tendencies here in Washington, and there's a legitimate debate, and one has to look at it that way. You have people who say that the best approach to world terrorism is through coalitions. We've all read Brent Scowcroft's piece in the Washington Post last week. You have people like Bernard Lewis and others, and Daniel Pipes, who argue that American unilateralism is best, that is in terms of achieving our objectives and in terms of not allying the U.S. with regimes that the U.S. does not agree with. My own view is this. If someone can show me how it can be done, I'll be interested in listening. Because in order, perhaps we don't quite understand the magnitude of this problem that we're facing. The pervasiveness of it, the potential of it, the ease of it, and what is required to win it, to win the battle. What is required in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of financial cooperation, in terms of physical cooperation, and the weakness of the U.S. in those areas especially, where the U.S. has very few assets that could be deployed directly in many of these countries, language knowledge, religious knowledge, a blending into society. I just don't see how that could be done personally, but I'd like to listen to ideas.
A couple of questions that try to ask in general how you equate the actions of Israelis in using gunships to kill Palestinian leaders and the assassination of Minister Zevi. Do you see a difference? Is one more noble than the other? Is there a relationship here?
I absolutely think all assassination without due course, without that is a court and legal process are wrong. I've always believed that Israeli assassinations of accused terrorists or political leaders is wrong, and I certainly believe that the assassination of Mr. Zevi is wrong. I think this is a cycle that is dangerous. It is dangerous not only because it's immoral, because you are not certain who the other party, whether the party is guilty or not. It is more difficult for Israel too because it is at once an enemy of these groups and still has the sovereign occupying power over it, and therefore technically the power to arrest. Therefore, it's a very complicated issue, both legally and morally, but it's clearly wrong. And consequentially, when you look at what happens, you have a cycle that is eroding the prospects of peace. You have an elevation, if you will, of the problem to target political leaders, which we don't know where it's going to end. And I fear the consequences, especially now that there seems to be an opportunity to get back to the negotiating table.
Speaking of the negotiating table, do you feel that the Palestinian Authority has the power to enforce any agreement that is reached, given the history of agreements that have never been fully carried out? And especially, what about Arafat? Is he a possible partner?
Well, that's a good question. There is no question that the Palestinian Authority's power has eroded over time rather than increased, but it's still powerful. But we have to understand the power of the authority as a function of two things. First, certainly its capacity, security capacity, its security apparatuses, which is still dominant, but also in terms of what it has to offer to the public. I mean, the battle in any society, and it is in the Palestinian state, is for the middle. You have essentially, if you sway the middle in one side, you're going to win them. If you sway them in the other side, you're not going to win. If you win the heart of the middle, you're going to be able to enforce it. What has happened is that in the past year, after the collapse of Camp David, when Arafat had nothing to offer to his public, he has no solution to offer diplomatically, and the militants are offering change, a possible change. His own popularity, as Khalil Shaqaqi's own polls, I see him sitting here, showed, declined to the 20s, just barely above Hamas's. He has the security apparatus to trump them, but he needs to win the heart of the majority. If he delivers a settlement that matches the core interests of the heart of the majority, his security apparatus will be effective because he will have the allegiance of the heart of the public.
A couple of questions on Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. How does it factor into this, and is the system in Saudi Arabia creating part of the problem through the pervasive influence of Wahhabism in the schools in Saudi Arabia and the younger generation growing up?
Look, as I said in my remarks, I do not believe the issue is religion that explains terrorism. Let's keep perspective here. There is fundamentalism in the Middle East, whether it's Wahhabism, Islamic, the Muslim Brotherhood, or any movement in the region. There is fundamentalism in the region. And one can argue whether it's good or bad for society. I mean, you know, there is an argument to be made that sending kids to study nothing but the Quran or the Bible all day long and at the expense of learning some technical skills is bad. That's an argument to be made for society, but it's a society's own argument to make. But fundamentalism in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it. We've had it for years. In fact, I would submit to you that there was more fundamentalism 100 years ago in the Middle East than there is today. Certainly there was more Christian fundamentalism than there is today. Fundamentalism itself comes and goes. There's cycles, societal cycle. What worries us, what concerns us, what should concern us as political observers or policymakers or diplomats is not fundamentalism, but the employment of fundamentalism for political ends and for violent political ends. And I don't think Wahhabism itself or Muslim Brotherhood itself theologically can explain the fact that these groups are employing violence for political ends.
Okay. There are a number of individuals who are questioning you about the concept of economic liberalization. The open markets, the globalization appears in many societies create greater divisions between the wealthy and the poor. How is this going to help in a process of moderating societies? And what specifically would we try to encourage these societies to do?
I think when I look at the Middle East, I have to be concerned about two structural problems. One is the relatively small share of private investment, the private resources, and there's private businesses in comparison to state businesses, and the relatively small share of international investment that the Middle East gets in comparison to the rest of the world. These are structural problems that have to be addressed. The privatization project, the encouragement of international investment project. But this is not a simple issue. There's a debate among economists, a debate among political scientists on how to do it. The issue, I think, is for the international community to put more thought into it, to create a more serious forum, and to put more resources into it. Let us think about how much this horror on September 11th cost economically. Just put that in perspective. And think about what it might cost in the future. And think in that magnitude in terms of what resources must be committed to try to narrow the gap that has to be narrowed.
Final question, and I apologize to those whose questions didn't get attached. We just ran out of time. But I think this is appropriate for the final question, Shibli. How do you see the role of Arab Americans in communicating a new vision, especially for moderates in their homelands?
You know, I think that in reaction to what happened on September 11th, I must say that the reaction of Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Jewish Americans, and other Americans has been splendid. There have been many episodes, unfortunately, of discrimination, and there were many. This has been a horror that everyone felt, but Arab American organizations asserted themselves very quickly as Americans, and I think that's very important because that's what they are. They have a right to advocate issues that they care about, but they are American, and they have asserted themselves as Americans. Muslim Americans have done the same. That's important. I think it is important down the road because in communicating with the region has to see America in its diversity. When they see Muslims and Arabs speaking as Americans, and particularly when Arab Americans and Muslim Americans become part of the political system in America, part of the elites in the political system in America, the level of communication, the sensitivity improves. I do think there was a debate back in the 1970s in Congress, which was talking about broadening the State Department to be more inclusive, to include people. In fact, the debate was mostly focused on Hispanic Americans. And Congresswoman Schroeder took the lead in making the argument that to have Hispanic Americans in the State Department would help America in the Spanish-speaking world, because they are sensitive to American interests, they're sensitive to Hispanic interests, people can relate to them, they can help bridge the gap. We've seen this happen with Jewish Americans who became much more part of the system, with Hispanic Americans, and it really has to happen with Arab Americans and Muslim Americans.
Shibli, I want to thank you very much for a very stimulating and terrific start for this conference. It's always a pleasure, and despite the fact you might think so, we did not conspire on the answer about is assassination legal or not. So, Shibli, thank you. We're going to take a 15-minute break now. Please be back by 10:30. Thank you.
You're watching continuing live coverage of a forum titled Middle East Challenges for the Bush Administration. It's sponsored by the Middle East Foundation. Panels that we'll be bringing you live coverage of a little bit later is one titled Arab-Israeli Peacemaking, 10 years after the Madrid Conference. That's the panel coming up after this 15-minute break. There'll be a break for lunch. Then this afternoon, a panel on challenges of globalization. Among the panelists, the Washington bureau chief of Al Jazeera. That's all coming up here on